Snow covered Route 250 so quickly that even the county plows struggled to keep pace. Around 7:40 that evening, a woman named Lorna Whitaker left her house outside Elkins, West Virginia, after answering a call from her husband at the clinic. One of his elderly patients had run out of heart medication, and the nearest pharmacy still had a pharmacist willing to stay open through the storm. Lorna told her husband she'd make the drive instead. 26 years later, during a routine upgrade from analog phone lines to a digital system, technicians uncovered an archive of forgotten answering machine recordings stored on backup tapes inside the clinic's old telephone exchange. Most were ordinary appointment requests. One recording had never been played. It had been left the same night Lorna disappeared. No one could explain why. The recording was time-stamped 8:26 p.m. Her abandoned car had already been reported by then. The engine had still been warm. The driver's door had been standing open. Yet whoever left that voicemail sounded convinced she was still alive. The recording ended before anyone answered. The voice never identified itself. How could someone know something investigators had spent 26 years trying to understand? Back in January of 1990, the storm arrived earlier than anyone expected. Weather forecasts warned of heavy snowfall, but residents around Elkins were used to winter weather. Roads remained open throughout the afternoon, and businesses stayed open as usual. Dr. Russell Whitaker had been called to a farmhouse several miles north after one of his longtime patients suffered chest pains. Before leaving the clinic, he realized another patient desperately needed medication before morning. He phoned home. Lorna answered on the second ring. According to Russell's statement later given to investigators, she laughed when he apologized for interrupting dinner. "I've got the car already warming up," she reportedly told him. She often helped around the clinic even though she wasn't officially employed there. She organized appointment books, called insurance companies, and occasionally delivered prescriptions when weather or distance made things difficult for elderly patients. It wasn't unusual. Nothing about that evening sounded unusual. She left home wearing a heavy navy winter coat, leather gloves and insulated boots. Their neighbor remembered seeing her scrape snow from the windshield before backing carefully onto the county road. That would become the last confirmed sighting. At 8:41 p.m., a volunteer firefighter driving home spotted a blue station wagon resting partly in a snowbank roughly 14 miles from town. The headlights were still on. The engine was running. The driver's door stood open against the wind. No one was inside. Visibility had dropped below 50 feet. Snow erased footprints within minutes. The firefighter searched around the vehicle as much as conditions allowed before using his radio to request assistance. Deputies arrived nearly 40 minutes later. By then, several inches of fresh snow had already buried everything surrounding the vehicle. Inside the car, investigators found Lorna's purse. Her wallet remained untouched. The pharmacy receipt sat folded on the passenger seat. She had picked up the medication exactly as planned. The paper bag containing the prescription rested on the floor behind the driver's seat. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing suggested anyone had searched the vehicle. The keys remained in the ignition. The heater was still blowing warm air. Deputies initially believed she had stepped away from the car after becoming stuck in deep snow, perhaps trying to find help at one of the scattered homes along the highway. But there was one immediate problem. No nearby resident reported anyone knocking on a door that night. The closest occupied house sat nearly half a mile away. In clear weather, it would have been visible. That night, it disappeared behind blowing snow. Within hours, the county organized volunteers, but the weather refused to cooperate. Roads closed one after another. Search dogs couldn't work effectively because drifting snow buried scent trails almost immediately. A National Guard helicopter remained grounded. The official search expanded only after the storm finally moved east nearly 2 days later. By then, fresh snow measured more than 3 feet across parts of the mountains. Entire fences had vanished beneath drifts. The abandoned station wagon looked completely different than it had on the first night. Search teams combed nearby woods, frozen creeks, abandoned logging roads and hunting cabins. Nothing. Not a glove. Not a scarf. Not a single personal item. The lack of evidence puzzled investigators almost immediately. If Lorna had wandered into the woods seeking shelter, something usually surfaced eventually. A piece of clothing. Tracks. Personal belongings. Instead, it felt as though the storm had swallowed every trace. State investigators interviewed dozens of residents over the following weeks. Several people remembered seeing the blue station wagon earlier that evening. One truck driver recalled following it for several miles before turning toward a lumber yard. He remembered the vehicle because it maintained an unusually careful speed. Nothing appeared wrong. Another witness believed she saw flashing headlights farther up the highway shortly afterward. She couldn't remember whether they belonged to an emergency vehicle or another passing car. That detail remained impossible to verify. Telephone records offered little help. In 1990, mobile phones were still uncommon in rural West Virginia, and Lorna didn't own one. Most communication depended on landlines. Investigators reconstructed her schedule almost minute by minute until she left the pharmacy. After that, everything became guesswork. The pharmacist clearly remembered their brief conversation because very few customers ventured out that evening. He estimated she left around 8:05 p.m. She joked about hoping the roads stayed open long enough to get home before her husband returned from his emergency visit. The drive should have taken roughly 20 minutes. Her vehicle was found about halfway home. The timeline simply stopped there. Weeks turned into months. Snow melted. Spring arrived. Volunteers searched again after the ground thawed. Hunters looked through remote areas during autumn. Logging crews reported anything unusual they encountered. Nothing connected to Lorna ever surfaced. As years passed, the disappearance slowly became part of local memory. Residents debated countless theories. Perhaps she accepted a ride from someone after becoming stranded. Perhaps another vehicle forced her off the road. Perhaps someone happened upon the abandoned car before authorities arrived. Every explanation created another unanswered question. Why leave behind the medication? Why leave her purse? Why leave a running vehicle in sub-freezing temperatures? Dr. Whitaker continued practicing medicine in town for years afterward. Patients often noticed he never changed one particular habit. Every evening before locking the clinic, he personally checked the old answering machine. No employee ever questioned why. Most assumed it was simply routine. Only much later would they discover there had been another reason entirely. Because for decades, Russell insisted there had always been one call missing from that night. No one believed him. Until technicians finally copied the forgotten analog recordings from the clinic's obsolete phone system and found a message stamped 8:26 p.m., recorded while deputies were already standing beside Lorna's abandoned station wagon. When the audio engineer first pressed play, the room fell silent after the first 3 seconds. The caller wasn't asking for a doctor. The caller wasn't leaving an appointment request. Whoever spoke began with 5 words that immediately forced investigators to reopen a file that had been collecting dust for 26 years. The voice was calm. Not rushed. Not frightened. It sounded like someone who believed they had reached the right number. If this is Dr. Whitaker. There was a pause. Your wife asked me to call. The tape hissed softly before the speaker continued. I found her on County Route 250. Her car stuck pretty bad. Another pause. She's fine. Just cold. The recording lasted only 23 seconds. The caller said they were taking Lorna somewhere warm until the weather eased. Then the line clicked. No names. No location. No callback number. Nothing else. When technicians digitized the recording in 2016, they initially assumed detectives already knew about it. They didn't. The original cassette answering machine inside the clinic had automatically erased old messages once they had been played. But this recording had never reached the machine. It had remained trapped inside backup storage within the aging telephone exchange after a switching error no one had ever noticed. The system had registered the incoming call. It had never completed the connection. Russell Whitaker listened to the audio 3 times before saying a word. According to everyone in the room, he stared at the table for nearly a minute. Finally, he quietly said something investigators would later include in their report. I never got that call. For 26 years, he had believed no one had seen Lorna after she left the pharmacy. Now there was evidence that someone had. The first question seemed obvious. Who made the call? The second question was harder. Why hadn't they contacted police afterward? State investigators assigned to the cold case began with the original telephone records. Most had long since been destroyed. Telephone companies in 1990 had no reason to preserve routine local call logs for decades. The clinic's monthly billing statements survived, but they listed only outgoing long-distance calls. Incoming local calls weren't itemized. The voicemail itself became the investigation. Audio specialists removed background noise one layer at a time. At first they focused on the speaker. Mel. Probably between 40 and 60 years old. No obvious regional accent beyond what could be expected in Central Appalachia. He spoke clearly, almost deliberately, as though choosing each word carefully. Then the analyst noticed something else. Behind the caller's voice came a faint metallic rhythm. It repeated every few seconds. Clang. Pause. Clang. Pause. Old railroad workers who later heard the enhanced recording suggested it sounded remarkably similar to a crossing signal. Others disagreed. Some believed it resembled loose chains striking metal in heavy wind. The sound alone couldn't identify a location. But another detail emerged. Just before the caller hung up, something passed in the background. It wasn't another voice. It was an automated announcement. Only 2 words could be understood. Westbound? The remainder disappeared beneath static. Detectives began reviewing maps from 1990. There were only a handful of places within driving distance where railroad crossings sat close enough to public telephones that both sounds could appear on the same recording. Most no longer existed. Several had been removed years earlier. One crossing immediately caught investigators' attention. It stood near an old volunteer fire station outside the tiny community of Cairns. The building had a payphone mounted outside until the late 1990s. It was less than 8 miles from where Lorna's station wagon had been found. Retired firefighters remembered the phone. Truck drivers used it. Travelers used it. Locals used it whenever winter storms knocked out power. Investigators searched old maintenance files and discovered something unexpected. The payphone had been repaired 3 days after Lorna disappeared. The work order described repeated complaints that callers could hear the other party, but the other party often couldn't hear them. Technicians called it a one-way audio failure. It was uncommon, but not impossible. The repair note stopped several detectives in their tracks. If someone had used that payphone on the night of the storm, they might have believed they successfully delivered the message. In reality, Russell Whitaker would have heard nothing. The caller may never have realized the voicemail failed. For the first time, investigators had a reasonable explanation for why no one tried calling again. They believed the message had gone through. The discovery shifted the entire timeline. Until then, police had assumed no verified contact with Lorna existed after she left the pharmacy. Now there appeared to be one. Someone claimed she was alive. Someone claimed she was with them. Someone claimed they intended to keep her warm until the roads improved. If that statement was true, then whatever happened to Lorna occurred after 8:26 p.m., not before. Detectives turned their attention to the area around the old fire station. Most of the original volunteers had either passed away or moved. Those still living struggled to remember a single snowy night from 26 years earlier. One former firefighter, however, hesitated when investigators mentioned the payphone. He didn't remember making any calls. He didn't remember seeing Lorna. But he remembered another vehicle. It wasn't listed anywhere in the original case file. He described an older pickup truck parked across the road from the station sometime after dark. What stood out wasn't the truck itself. It was the color. Bright yellow. An unusual choice for rural West Virginia in the middle of winter. He told detectives he'd always assumed it belonged to a highway worker. But when investigators checked county transportation records, every snowplow and maintenance truck operating that night had already been accounted for. None were yellow. The witness couldn't recall a license plate. He couldn't remember the make. Only one detail stayed with him all those years. The truck had a large metal toolbox mounted behind the cab. That was enough for investigators to begin searching vehicle registrations from 1990. Thousands of records had to be reviewed by hand because they had never been digitized. Weeks passed with nothing. Then a clerk in Charleston noticed a registration card that had been misfiled decades earlier. It belonged to a privately owned yellow pickup with a utility toolbox. The registered owner lived less than 10 miles from the abandoned fire station. And according to county tax records, he had died in 2008. When detectives visited the property, they expected to find nothing more than an old address. Instead, the man's daughter answered the door. She had spent years cleaning out barns and sheds after inheriting the land. When investigators explained why they were there, she frowned for a moment. Then she said something that no one in the room expected. "I still have Dad's notebooks." She disappeared into the house. Several minutes later, she returned carrying 3 weathered spiral notebooks tied together with faded blue twine. "They're mostly mileage logs," she said. But every now and then, he'd write down strange things that happened on the road. One entry was dated January 14, 1990. The exact night Lorna Whitaker vanished. Before detectives even finished turning the page, they noticed a sentence that had been underlined twice. The handwriting was neat. Block letters. Every trip began the same way. Date. Starting mileage. Destination. Weather. Most entries took up only 2 or 3 lines. January 14, 1990, covered nearly an entire page. The first line read, "Heavy snow. Visibility almost gone after sunset. Below it were several notes about delivering furnace parts to farms west of Elkins. Times had been written in the margins, though not every stop included one. Then investigators reached the underlined sentence. Woman in blue wagon waved me down near Miller's Curve. The room went quiet. Lorna had been driving a blue station wagon. Miller's Curve was less than half a mile from where her car was eventually found. The entry continued. Car wouldn't move. Told her I'd call from the fire station phone. That matched the voicemail. The notebook appeared to explain why the caller never gave his name. He hadn't believed it mattered. He expected Dr. Whitaker to arrive shortly. But the next lines raised more questions than they answered. She didn't want to leave the car. Then another sentence. Said she was worried someone might need the medicine. Detectives compared that statement with photographs taken inside the abandoned vehicle. The prescription bag had been found behind the driver's seat. If the notebook was accurate, then Lorna had still been holding the medication when the truck driver met her. Somewhere between that encounter and the arrival of deputies, she had returned it to the car. The timeline no longer fit the original investigation. The notebook described another detail that had never appeared in any police report. The driver wrote that another vehicle approached while they were talking. He didn't describe it well. Only this. Dark pickup. Pulled over behind us for less than a minute. He added one final sentence. Driver asked if we needed help. Woman answered before I could. There was no quotation. No description of the other driver. No license plate. The notebook simply continued. Told him everything was okay. Then came another gap. Several blank lines separated the next entry. When writing resumed, the handwriting looked noticeably different. Less steady. The letters leaned to one side. Went to fire station. Used phone. Nobody answered. That aligned almost perfectly with the recovered voicemail. But the final paragraph had never been mentioned to anyone. Returned maybe 20 minutes later. Detectives stopped reading. 20 minutes. That was enough time for almost anything to happen. The notebook continued. Blue wagon still there. Door open. Lights on. Woman gone. Nothing else. No explanation. No speculation. Just 4 short observations. The driver apparently left after spotting emergency lights in the distance. If the notebook was truthful, he never spoke to investigators. His daughter couldn't explain why. She insisted her father wasn't the kind of man who avoided police. He always stopped to help people, she said. He would have told them if he thought it mattered. Detectives searched the original case file again. His name wasn't there. Neither was the yellow truck. Neither was any report describing a second visit to the abandoned car. The omission became one of the biggest mysteries in the reopened investigation. Did he assume officers already knew? Did he try calling later? Or had investigators simply overlooked him during the chaos of the storm? While reviewing the notebook, a forensic document examiner noticed something almost everyone else had missed. The indentation on the page beneath the January 14th entry suggested another sentence had originally been written before being crossed out so heavily that the ink tore through the paper. Using oblique lighting, they could make out only fragments. Looked back. Standing. Not alone. The missing words couldn't be recovered. Too much of the page had been damaged. Investigators resisted drawing conclusions. The fragments were too incomplete to support any theory. Still, they couldn't ignore them. If the truck driver had deliberately erased part of his account, why? The answer seemed more likely to be found somewhere else. His daughter mentioned that her father almost never traveled without a small cassette recorder. He dictated mileage instead of writing while driving. Later, he'd copy those notes into the spiral notebooks. Detectives immediately searched the property. The recorder was gone. Most of the old cassettes had been thrown away years earlier during a cleanup after his death. But not all of them. A cardboard box sat on a shelf inside the barn. Dust covered the lid. Inside were dozens of unlabeled microcassette tapes held together with rubber bands that had long since crumbled. Many contained nothing more than delivery notes. Addresses. Fuel stops. Weather observations. One cassette had no writing at all. Only a small strip of faded masking tape. On it, in barely visible pencil, was a single date. 1/14/90. The tape had warped with age. Forensic technicians baked it at low temperature for several hours before attempting to play it, a standard preservation technique used on deteriorating magnetic recordings. Even then, they made only one pass. The first minute contained exactly what investigators expected. The driver dictated mileage, road conditions, customer names. He complained about the snow piling against the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. Then the recording changed. His voice became quieter, almost conversational. "Blue wagon, lady stuck." The sound of a truck door opening interrupted him. Wind rushed across the microphone. For nearly 30 seconds there was nothing except the storm. Then another voice appeared. A woman. Only a few words were understandable. "Doctor? Medicine. Thank you." Investigators could not state with certainty that the voice belonged to Lorna Whitaker. But it matched her age and it matched the circumstances described in the notebook. The driver spoke again. Said, "I'll call her husband." Footsteps crunched through snow. A vehicle engine idled nearby. Then came something no one expected. Another engine approached from behind. The driver stopped talking. A truck door slammed. A second male voice called out through the wind. The tape was too distorted to understand the full sentence. Audio specialists enhanced it repeatedly. Most attempts produced different interpretations. Only 4 words remained consistent. "You folks okay here?" That matched the notebook almost exactly. The first driver answered, "We're fine." Then the woman said something. Not to the first driver. To the newcomer. The microphone failed to capture her response. Seconds later, the second engine drove away. The recorder continued running. The first driver laughed softly. "Everybody's checking on everybody tonight." He closed his truck door. The cassette captured several minutes of driving toward the volunteer fire station. The railroad crossing bells rang in the distance. A train horn echoed through the valley. Investigators had finally identified the metallic sound from the voicemail. The driver parked. His footsteps crossed gravel. A payphone receiver lifted. Coins dropped. Then the familiar message played. The same 23-second voicemail that technicians had recovered from the clinic's telephone exchange. Except this version continued. After hanging up, the driver didn't stop recording. He returned to his truck and spoke into the recorder. "Hope Doc gets there before this gets worse." That sentence had never been heard before. It revealed what he believed would happen next. He expected Dr. Whitaker to reach his wife. Not the sheriff. Not a tow truck. Her husband. The tape skipped forward. Several seconds were missing where the magnetic coating had peeled away. When audio resumed, the driver was back on the highway. His breathing sounded heavier. He spoke immediately. "That's strange." Another pause. "Car's still there." A gust of wind struck the microphone. "No lady." He shut off the recorder. The tape ended. That was all. No confrontation. No screams. No sounds suggesting a crime. Only an ordinary man documenting something he found confusing. Yet the recording narrowed the timeline further than investigators had ever managed before. Lorna had been alive when the yellow truck left for the fire station. She was gone when it returned. The gap was approximately 18 to 23 minutes. Detectives reconstructed every known movement during that window. The truck driver's route was confirmed by fuel receipts. The pharmacy closing time matched. The emergency dispatch log matched. Even snowfall estimates matched weather records from January 14, 1990. One detail, however, did not. While reviewing archived county radio traffic, a communications analyst noticed an unexplained transmission at 8:31 p.m., 5 minutes after the voicemail had been left. It wasn't from law enforcement. It wasn't from the fire department. It came from a highway maintenance frequency. The dispatcher asked a simple question. "Unit 12, you still on 250? There was no reply. 30 seconds later, the dispatcher repeated the call. Again, nothing. The log showed Unit 12 never acknowledged either transmission. Oddly, no maintenance report listed the unit working during the storm. County transportation records identified every assigned snowplow. They were numbered 1 through 11. There had never been an official Unit 12. At least, not according to any surviving records. When investigators asked retired highway supervisors about it, most shook their heads. One former mechanic hesitated. Then he said something that redirected the investigation yet again. There wasn't a Unit 12. He paused before adding. But there was a truck everybody called 12. It wasn't county-owned. It belonged to a private contractor occasionally hired during severe storms. The county paid him by the hour whenever extra equipment was needed. The truck wasn't orange. It wasn't white. According to the mechanic, there was only one reason everyone remembered it after all those years. It was painted bright yellow. The retired mechanic gave investigators a name. Calvin Reddick. He wasn't a county employee. He owned a small excavation business outside Beverly, West Virginia, and every winter the county occasionally hired him when heavy snowfall overwhelmed its own equipment. His loader, dump truck and pickup all carried the same bright yellow paint. The color made them easy to spot during storms. The contract files confirmed it. Invoices from January 1990 showed Reddick had been called in twice that winter. One invoice covered the week before Lorna disappeared. The second began 3 days after the storm. Nothing showed he had been officially working on the night of January 14th. But there was another problem. No one could explain why the dispatcher had attempted to reach Unit 12. Investigators located the original dispatcher, now in her 70s. She still remembered the storm. Not the individual radio calls but the night itself. It was chaos, she said. Trees down. Cars stuck everywhere. Everybody was using everybody else's radios. When detectives played the archive transmission, she frowned. I recognized my voice. She listened again. I wouldn't have called 12 unless someone told me he was out. Who would have told you? I don't know. We didn't write that part down. Emergency logs from 1990 were handwritten. Many pages had faded. Several were missing altogether. The dispatcher couldn't remember whether Calvin Reddick had actually checked in that night or whether someone merely reported seeing him. By then, Reddick himself had been dead for almost 11 years. His wife had passed away shortly after him. Their only son, Mark, still owned the family property. He agreed to speak with investigators. Mark described his father as dependable. He never ignored somebody stranded. When detectives asked about January 14, 1990, Mark slowly shook his head. I was 16. I remember the storm. I remember Dad leaving after dinner. That's about it. He believed his father had gone out to clear private driveways. Nothing unusual. Then investigators asked about the yellow pickup. Mark smiled. I've still got it. The truck sat inside an old machine shed beneath a canvas cover. Dust coated the hood. The odometer hadn't moved in years. Everything inside appeared untouched. Investigators photographed the cab before examining it. The glove box contained registration papers, road maps, a faded flashlight. Nothing significant. Then one detective folded down the passenger sun visor. A small stack of yellowed papers slipped onto the seat. Fuel receipts, equipment invoices, a folded county road map, and a business card. It belonged to Dr. Russell Whitaker. On the back, someone had written in blue ink, "Home, if emergency." The phone number matched the Whitakers' residence in 1990. Mark stared at it. I've never seen that before. Detectives couldn't determine when the card had been placed there. It could have been weeks before the disappearance. Or that very night. Russell confirmed he occasionally handed out cards to local contractors who worked in remote areas. If someone got hurt on a job, they knew how to reach me. That alone proved nothing. The truck underwent a detailed forensic examination despite its age. After 26 years, investigators expected little. The interior had been cleaned countless times. Weather had taken its toll. Still, the crime laboratory recovered several microscopic fibers trapped beneath the passenger side seat mounting bolts. The fibers were dark blue. Similar in color to the winter coat Lorna had reportedly been wearing. But similar fibers were common. The laboratory refused to make any identification. Without the original coat for comparison, which had never been found, the evidence remained inconclusive. The truck yielded something else. Not forensic evidence. A maintenance notebook tucked inside the owner's manual. Unlike the mileage logs, this notebook recorded repairs. Oil changes. Brake work. Tire replacements. One page stood out. January 15, 1990. The morning after Lorna disappeared. The single entry read, "Passenger door won't latch. Frozen shut last night." That seemed ordinary. Until investigators noticed another line squeezed into the margin. Written later in different ink. Finally dried seat. No explanation followed. Mark looked puzzled. My dad hated wet upholstery. He always complained if snow got inside. The comment sounded harmless. But detectives knew something. The weather records showed temperatures remained below freezing for nearly 3 straight days after the storm. Snow tracked into the truck should have frozen. Not simply dried. Unless the truck had spent time somewhere heated. Or unless what soaked the passenger seat wasn't melted snow from boots. The evidence wasn't enough to accuse anyone. It wasn't even enough to call Calvin Reddick a suspect. But it justified looking deeper into his movements. Bank records. Fuel purchases. Telephone bills. Insurance claims. Anything that still existed. Most had long been destroyed. One record survived almost by accident. A ledger from the Beverly Co-op fuel depot. Farmers and contractors often bought diesel on account rather than paying cash. The handwritten ledger showed Calvin filled his pickup at 6:58 p.m. on January 14. The next entry wasn't until the following afternoon. But beside the first purchase, the clerk had added a note. Not about fuel. About a conversation. The handwriting read. Said he was heading toward Route 250 before it closed. That route led directly toward Miller's Curve. Exactly where the yellow truck driver in the notebook had stopped to help Lorna. For years, investigators believed there had been only one yellow pickup near the abandoned station wagon that night. Now there appeared to have been two. One belonged to the helpful delivery driver whose notebook and cassette had finally surfaced. The other belonged to a contractor whose movements during the critical 20-minute window remained almost entirely undocumented. Detectives began comparing the two timelines. At first they overlapped only briefly. Then an analyst noticed something on an enlarged county road map. Less than a mile separated the payphone at the volunteer fire station from a narrow gravel access road that had existed in 1990 but was later abandoned after a bridge washed out. The road no longer appeared on modern GPS maps. It led to only three places: an abandoned logging yard, a closed equipment shed, and an isolated maintenance garage leased by private snow removal contractors during severe winters. County property records showed the leaseholder in January 1990. It was signed by one name: Calvin Reddick. The maintenance garage had been demolished in 2004. A flood damaged the foundation, and the county ordered the structure torn down before winter. By the time detectives reopened the case, only a cracked concrete pad remained. The surrounding woods had reclaimed most of the property. Young maple trees grew where trucks had once been parked. An old gravel loop was barely visible beneath decades of leaves. Investigators weren't expecting evidence. They were looking for context. The garage sat less than 7 minutes from Miller's Curve in good weather. In the storm conditions recorded that night, the drive would have taken closer to 12. That mattered. If someone had left Lorna's car at approximately 8:10 p.m., driven to the garage and then returned, the timing fit almost perfectly inside the unexplained 20-minute gap. Ground-penetrating radar found nothing unusual beneath the concrete. The county's demolition records showed no undocumented structures. No hidden storage rooms. No sealed wells. Nothing. The site appeared exactly what it had always been: a place to park equipment. Even so, detectives interviewed former contractors who had worked there during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Most remembered Calvin Reddick as quiet, reliable, the type of man who stayed after everyone else left to finish repairs. No one described him as violent. No one recalled complaints against him. Then one retired mechanic mentioned something that had never appeared in any employment file. Calvin wasn't the only one with keys. The garage had 4 key holders. The county supervisor, the road foreman, Calvin Reddick, and another contractor named Dwayne Haskell. Unlike Calvin, Haskell was still alive. He had moved to eastern Ohio after retiring. Detectives arranged an interview. Haskell welcomed them into his kitchen before they had even explained why they were there. When they mentioned January 1990, he immediately looked toward the window. I wondered if somebody would come back to that. It was the first time in 26 years that anyone connected to the old garage had volunteered information before being asked a question. Investigators let the silence sit. Finally, Haskell spoke. I wasn't supposed to be working that night. He explained that another contractor had called asking for help clearing fallen trees near Route 250. The weather was worsening, so he drove toward the garage to pick up a chainsaw kept inside. He estimated arriving sometime after 8 o'clock. The garage was dark. No trucks. No lights. He unlocked the door, collected the equipment, and left within minutes. Nothing unusual. At least that's what he had always believed. Then detectives played the recovered voicemail. Haskell listened without interrupting. When it ended, he leaned forward. I know that railroad crossing. Detectives nodded. So do we. He shook his head. No. You don't understand. The payphone wasn't the only phone there. The old fire station had a landline inside the building for volunteers. During storms, if the public payphone failed, locals sometimes used the station phone instead. Detectives exchanged glances. No report had ever mentioned a second telephone. County maintenance records focused only on the exterior payphone because it belonged to the telephone company. The internal line belonged to the volunteer fire department. Most of those records had never been requested during the original investigation. Haskell continued. The chief hated people using the station phone unless they had permission. So somebody usually locked the building. Unless. He stopped. Unless one of the volunteers was already there. Investigators pulled the original dispatch logs again. This time they weren't looking for law enforcement. They wanted volunteer firefighters. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the storm. Aaron Pike. Pike coordinated several roadside assistance calls before midnight. His reports placed him within a few miles of Miller's Curve more than once. Unlike many others involved in the case, Aaron Pike was still living in Randolph County. He agreed to meet detectives the following week. Before they asked about Lorna, Pike surprised them with a question. "You finally found the voicemail?" The detectives froze. They hadn't mentioned it. Neither had the newspaper articles announcing the case had been reopened. Only a handful of investigators knew the voicemail existed. One detective asked carefully, "How did you know about a voicemail?" Pike looked confused. "I thought that's why you were here." "No. Then what are you asking me?" The night Lorna Whitaker disappeared. Pike leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he rubbed his forehead. "I've carried this around a long time." He explained that during the storm he had been stationed at the volunteer fire hall, answering calls while crews responded to stranded motorists. The public payphone outside rang constantly. People used it because many homes had already lost power. Around 8:30 p.m., a man came inside asking whether the station phone worked better than the payphone. Pike remembered the question because the man seemed frustrated. He said he'd already tried calling once. Did he say who he was calling? A doctor. Pike couldn't remember the name. Only that it involved a stranded woman. He pointed toward the old equipment bay, long since renovated. The phone was on the wall right there. Detectives asked the obvious question. Did he make another call? I assumed he did. You didn't hear it? No. A truck alarm went off outside. I walked out to deal with it. When I came back. He hesitated. The man was gone. Detectives reviewed every document from 1990 once more. There was no record of anyone checking the fire station telephone. No record of outgoing calls. But volunteer departments often paid flat monthly rates for local service. Detailed call logs were rarely kept. If the man had used the station phone instead of the faulty payphone, another message might have reached the clinic. Or perhaps even reached Russell directly. Unless that call had failed too. Before ending the interview, one detective asked Pike to describe the man as best he could. Pike closed his eyes. Average height. Heavy winter coat. Wool cap. I never saw his face clearly. What about his truck? Pike answered without hesitation. It wasn't yellow. He paused. It was white. Then he added one detail that had never appeared in any report. It had the name of a company painted on both doors. What company? Pike frowned. I've been trying to remember that for 26 years. It started with. He looked down at the table. A red pine tree logo. And I know that because I remember thinking I'd seen that logo somewhere before. Investigators left the interview with the first new lead in weeks. A company logo. Not a person. Not a license plate. Just the memory of a red pine tree painted on the doors of a white work truck. Memory is imperfect, especially after 26 years. Detectives knew that. They also knew that unusual logos tend to stay with people longer than names. A graphic designer from the state police helped recreate several possible versions based on Pike's description. They weren't looking for an exact match. They were looking for recognition. The sketches were shown to former contractors, mechanics, delivery drivers, and retired county workers who had been active around Randolph County in 1990. Most shook their heads. The 19th interview changed everything. A retired fuel distributor studied one of the drawings for nearly a minute. That's close. He reached into a cabinet beside his desk and removed a 3-ring binder. Inside were faded business cards from companies that had purchased commercial fuel during the late 1980s. Halfway through the binder he stopped. This isn't the same logo. He pointed at the card. But it's close enough that I'd bet this is what your witness remembered. The card belonged to Red Pine Forestry Services. The company no longer existed. It had operated out of a small yard outside Parsons, West Virginia, until dissolving in the mid-1990s. Investigators immediately searched state corporate records. Red Pine Forestry Services had owned 3 white pickups, 1 flatbed truck, several pieces of logging equipment. The owner, Harold Voss, had died in 2003. The business records listed only 4 employees during the winter of 1990. 2 had also passed away. The remaining 2 agreed to interviews. Neither remembered January 14 specifically. But both remembered company policy. Whenever severe weather closed logging operations, employees were sent home. No one should have been driving a company truck that night. One detective asked whether anyone had borrowed vehicles after hours. Both men gave the same answer. Only Harold. That narrowed the focus considerably. Investigators located Harold Voss's surviving daughter, Denise. She still had boxes of her father's paperwork stored in the attic. Payroll, insurance, vehicle maintenance, tax returns. Nothing appeared connected to the disappearance. Then she found a spiral desk calendar. Each day contained short handwritten reminders. January 14, 1990, included only 3 entries. 8 a.m., cancel timber crew. 2:30 p.m., parts delivery. And written in different ink near the bottom of the page. Return truck. No truck number. No employee name. Just 2 words and a question mark. Denise couldn't explain it. My dad always knew where his trucks were. So why write yourself a reminder? She had no answer. Investigators tracked down the company's insurance records. Vehicle claims. Repair invoices. Annual inspections. One invoice caught their attention. Dated January 17, 1990. 3 days after Lorna disappeared. It authorized replacement of the driver's side mirror on one of the white pickups. The reason was handwritten. Mirror broken by impact with tree limb. The repair itself wasn't unusual. The timing was. The invoice listed the truck's mileage. A transportation analyst compared it with the previous service record from December. The truck had accumulated nearly 420 miles in less than a month. Far more than the company's other pickups during the same period. Where those miles had been driven was impossible to determine. But another document survived in the same file. The mechanic's inspection sheet. Most boxes were routine. Lights, brakes, tires. Near the bottom, under customer comments, someone had written, interior soaked after storm. Dry before delivery. The phrase immediately reminded detectives of Calvin Reddick's maintenance notebook. Finally dried seat. 2 unrelated vehicles. 2 different owners. Both with unusually wet interiors immediately after the same winter storm. That alone proved nothing. Snowstorms soaked vehicles every winter. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the coincidence. The cold case team created a detailed timeline covering every known vehicle that had entered the Route 250 corridor between 7:30 and 9 p.m. Lorna's blue station wagon. The yellow delivery truck. Calvin Reddick's yellow pickup. The unidentified white forestry pickup. Emergency vehicles. Snowplows. Civilian reports. The board stretched across an entire conference room wall. Colored strings connected times, roads, and witnesses. One detective stepped back. Something bothered him. Not a piece of evidence. An absence. Everyone had focused on vehicles. No one had asked where the medication was supposed to go. The prescription hadn't been intended for Lorna. It belonged to one of Dr. Whitaker's patients. The original case file identified the patient only by initials to protect medical privacy. Those initials had never been released publicly. The patient had died years earlier. With court approval, investigators finally opened the sealed medical records associated with that emergency prescription. The patient's address surprised them. It wasn't north of Elkins, where Russell had been making his emergency visit. It wasn't near Miller's Curve. It was on a small county road that branched off Route 250 less than 2 miles beyond the spot where Lorna's car was found. Detectives spread an old highway map across the table. The route was obvious. To reach the patient's farmhouse, Lorna would have driven directly past the location where her station wagon was later discovered. Then one investigator noticed something no one had realized in 26 years. According to the pharmacy receipt, Lorna picked up the medication at 8:05 p.m. According to the doctor's original statement, she was bringing it home. But according to the patient's medical chart, Dr. Whitaker had actually written a different instruction that afternoon. In his own handwriting were 6 words. Deliver directly if weather permits. That meant Lorna may never have intended to drive home first. She may have been trying to complete the delivery herself. If that was true, then everyone, including investigators, witnesses, and even Russell Whitaker, had built the timeline around a destination that may never have been her destination at all. The discovery prompted detectives to revisit Russell Whitaker's original interview. Not the summary. The actual audio. Fortunately, the sheriff's office had preserved a cassette of the interview in its evidence archive. The tape was digitized and compared against the typed transcript created in 1990. They weren't identical. The transcript captured the substance of Russell's answers, but it omitted pauses, corrections, and unfinished thoughts. One exchange immediately stood out. The detective had asked a simple question. Where was your wife headed after the pharmacy? Russell answered without hesitation. Home. Then he stopped. Several seconds of silence followed. On the tape, the detective could be heard waiting. Russell spoke again. Actually, he never finished the sentence. The detective interrupted with another question. The interview moved on. The transcript simply recorded the answer as home. No one in 1990 appeared to have noticed the interruption. When investigators played the audio for Russell in 2016, he closed his eyes before responding. I remember that. He explained that he had changed his mind in the middle of the answer because he had suddenly realized there had been two possible plans. He and Lorna had discussed them quickly over the phone. If the roads remained passable, she might continue on to the patient's farmhouse instead of returning to town. He couldn't remember exactly what they had decided. It was less than a minute. I thought I told her to come straight home. You thought? I've replayed that conversation thousands of times. He looked down at the table. I'm not sure anymore. That uncertainty mattered. Human memory changes, especially after decades. Investigators could no longer assume Russell's recollection from 1990 was accurate. They turned instead to objective evidence. The pharmacy sat at the southern edge of Elkins. The patient's farmhouse lay northeast. Russell and Lorna's house was northwest. For nearly 4 miles, both routes followed the same highway. Then they split. Miller's Curve, the location where Lorna's station wagon was found, was beyond that intersection. If she had been driving home, she would have turned off before reaching it. If she was heading to the patient, she would have continued straight. For 26 years, everyone had overlooked the simplest fact in the case. The abandoned car had been found on the road to the patient, not on the road home. The original assumption had been wrong. That single correction reshaped the entire timeline. Lorna hadn't driven past her turn. She had been exactly where she should have been. Detectives next examined the prescription itself. The bottle had been photographed inside the station wagon before being returned to the pharmacy after the investigation. Those photographs still existed. One investigator enlarged the label. The medication had been dispensed at 7:58 p.m. Below the dosage instructions appeared a handwritten note from the pharmacist. Call if arrival delayed. That wasn't unusual. The patient suffered from a heart condition, and weather often interrupted deliveries. The pharmacist explained he occasionally wrote reminders like that on emergency prescriptions. Then he added something else. I did make a call. Detectives looked up. I called the farmhouse around 8:45. Did anyone answer? No. Did you leave a message? There wasn't an answering machine. He had assumed the patient had gone to bed. Only after learning Lorna was missing did he realize she had never arrived. The patient's son had given a statement in 1990. He had been living in Charleston and didn't reach the farmhouse until the next morning. He told investigators his father never mentioned expecting a visitor. At the time, detectives considered that insignificant. Now it raised another question. If Lorna intended to deliver the medication, why hadn't she reached the farmhouse? The distance from Miller's Curve to the patient's driveway was less than 2 miles. Even in the storm, it should have taken only a few minutes. Unless something interrupted her first. A search of county maps revealed only one place between the curve and the farmhouse where a driver might reasonably stop. A narrow one-lane bridge crossing Shavers Fork. The bridge had since been replaced. The original timber structure was removed in 1998. Construction photographs survived in the county engineering office. One image caught an investigator's attention. Mounted beside the bridge entrance had been an emergency call box. It predated widespread cellular service. Motorists could use it to contact the county road department if flooding, fallen trees, or accidents blocked the crossing. The call box had been removed years before Lorna disappeared because it rarely worked. Maintenance logs confirmed repeated electrical failures throughout the late 1980s. One log, dated January 13, 1990, the day before Lorna vanished, contained a handwritten complaint. Intermittent activation. False signal received twice. The following page recorded no repair. The storm arrived before technicians could reach it. The old system transmitted a simple alert whenever someone lifted the receiver. No voice. Just a signal to the county dispatcher. Investigators requested every surviving dispatch log from that night. Most had already been reviewed years earlier. This time they searched for something different. Not emergency calls. Equipment alerts. Near the bottom of one handwritten page, squeezed into the margin between weather updates, appeared a brief notation made at 8:18 p.m. Bridge box, 250. No contact. No unit had been dispatched. The dispatcher apparently assumed it was another false alarm. No one had connected that entry to Lorna's disappearance. If she had stopped at the bridge and attempted to use the emergency call box, investigators had never known. The timing fit. It fell squarely between her departure from the pharmacy and the recovered voicemail from the payphone. But one detail didn't. The bridge sat almost a mile beyond where her station wagon was later found. For the alert to have come from Lorna, she would have had to pass Miller's Curve, reach the bridge, activate the call box, and then somehow return to the location where her car was eventually discovered. Nothing in the evidence supported that sequence. Unless someone else had activated the bridge call box. Or unless the location attached to the dispatcher's handwritten note had been wrong. Detectives resisted the temptation to build a theory around a single handwritten note. Before drawing conclusions, they wanted to know how those dispatch entries had actually been made in 1990. The dispatcher who worked that night still had her old training manual. She retrieved it from a box in her basement. The binder explained something no one on the cold case team had known. Bridge call boxes did not automatically transmit their exact location. Each signal arrived only as a circuit number. The dispatcher had to match that number to a printed reference chart. If the chart was outdated, or if the dispatcher grabbed the wrong page during a busy storm, the location could be recorded incorrectly. The original reference chart had not survived. But an identical copy from 1989 was found in the county archives. Circuit 14 corresponded to the bridge east of Miller's Curve. Circuit 15 belonged to a completely different emergency phone nearly 6 miles away. The numbers were adjacent. Easy to confuse, especially during a blizzard. That meant the notation bridge box, 250, could have referred to the wrong call box entirely. Investigators expanded their search to every emergency telephone that existed in Randolph County in January 1990. There had been 7. 6 had been removed before 2000. One remained standing, disconnected, beside an abandoned maintenance road. It wasn't near a bridge. It was near the entrance to the old Red Pine Forestry lease. The coincidence immediately caught investigators' attention. The call box had originally been installed because logging trucks frequently became stranded there during winter. County maintenance records described it as Circuit 15. If the dispatcher accidentally copied the wrong location into the log, then the unexplained activation at 8:18 p.m. may not have come from the bridge at all. It may have come from the forestry road. Detectives visited the site. The metal call box still stood on its steel post, rusted nearly through. The handset was gone. The wiring had been cut years earlier. But the faded identification plate remained bolted to the side. Circuit 15. The location changed the investigation. The forestry road intersected Route 250 less than half a mile beyond Miller's Curve. A driver leaving the highway could disappear from view within seconds. The access road wound through dense timber before splitting in two. One branch continued toward the former logging yard. The other climbed gradually to the maintenance garage leased by private contractors. Detectives walked the entire route using aerial photographs from 1990. About a quarter mile from the highway they found something unexpected. Not evidence. A line of sight. From a small rise in the road, a person could see traffic entering Miller's Curve through the trees during winter, when the branches were bare. Conversely, motorists on Route 250 could not see vehicles parked on the forestry road. Someone waiting there would have remained hidden. The discovery explained why no witness had ever reported seeing another vehicle leave the highway. An analyst overlaid the old aerial photographs with modern satellite imagery. One feature stood out. In 1990, a small equipment shed stood near the entrance to the forestry road. It had been removed sometime in the late 1990s. County tax records identified the owner. Not Red Pine Forestry. The structure belonged to the telephone company. Investigators were surprised. Why would the telephone company maintain a building there? The answer came from a retired line technician. It wasn't a building, he said. It was a repeater hut. Inside were amplifiers that boosted long-distance and emergency telephone signals through the mountains. Technicians visited it regularly. Most people driving past never knew what it was. He also mentioned something else. The repeater hut contained its own maintenance log. Every technician who entered signed the book. Detectives tracked down the company's archived records. Thousands of maintenance documents had been boxed and stored after a corporate merger. After 2 weeks of searching, archivists located the logbook from the repeater hut. The entries were routine. Battery checks, fuse replacements, storm inspections. Then came January 15, 1990. One technician wrote, Responded to repeated alarm overnight. No fault found. The time of arrival was 7:12 a.m. The technician added that the alarm system had activated several times between approximately 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock the previous evening. Each activation indicated that someone had opened the hut's exterior door. But when he arrived the next morning, everything inside was normal. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been damaged. The lock still worked. The hut wasn't open to the public. Only telephone company employees carried keys. Or so everyone believed. When investigators examined the technician's report more closely, they noticed a handwritten addendum attached several weeks later. One sentence had been circled in red by a supervisor. Possible duplicate master key unaccounted for. There was no follow-up. No indication the missing key had ever been recovered. No report of unauthorized entry. The issue appeared to have been closed administratively. The cold case team immediately requested personnel files for every technician assigned to that repeater hut in January 1990. Most had retired. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the maintenance records. Martin Keene. Keene was still living in Western Virginia. He agreed to speak by phone before investigators traveled to meet him. At first, he remembered nothing unusual about the storm. Then detectives mentioned the missing master key. There was a long silence. Finally, Keene said quietly, "I don't think it was missing." "What do you mean?" "I think I knew who had it." "Who?" "It wasn't an employee." Another pause. "I loaned it to someone." Detectives asked when. "I can't remember the exact date." "Winter of 1990. Maybe a few days before that storm." "Why would you loan a master key to a non-employee?" Keene sighed. "Because he told me one of our call boxes kept freezing shut." "He said he was helping the county." "What was his name?" "I only met him once. But I remember one thing. He drove a white pickup with a red pine tree painted on the door." Detectives traveled to Western Virginia the following morning. Martin Keene had spent more than 30 years maintaining telephone infrastructure across the mountains. His memory of most service calls had faded long ago. But he never forgot the man with the white pickup. He introduced himself as Harold. That matched the owner of Red Pine Forestry Services. Keene explained that Harold Voss had approached him after reporting repeated problems with one of the roadside emergency phones. "He knew the roads better than we did," Keene said. "I figured he'd save us a trip." Against company policy, Keene loaned him a master key that opened roadside call boxes and repeater huts. He expected to get it back within a few days. "I honestly forgot about it." The supervisor's note about an unaccounted for duplicate master key suddenly made sense. The key had never been stolen. It had been loaned out. Investigators reconstructed the final known timeline one last time. At approximately 8:05 p.m., Lorna left the pharmacy. Sometime after that, her station wagon became stuck near Miller's Curve. A passing delivery driver stopped to help. He offered to call her husband. A second pickup briefly stopped behind them before continuing on. The delivery driver drove to the volunteer fire station and attempted to reach Dr. Whitaker. The first call never connected because of the faulty payphone. During those same minutes, someone activated the emergency telephone circuit near the forestry road. The repeater hut alarm also triggered several times. Then everything went quiet. When the delivery driver returned less than 20 minutes later, Lorna was gone. Her purse remained inside the station wagon. The medication had been placed behind the driver's seat. The engine was still running. The investigators believed they finally understood why the original case had stalled. The storm had erased nearly every physical trace. The most important voicemail had never reached its destination. A witness had written his account in a notebook that no one saw for 26 years. A cassette recording sat forgotten in a barn. A maintenance log remained boxed inside a corporate archive. Each piece alone meant very little. Together they revealed something different. Not proof of what happened. Proof that the original investigation had been missing critical information from the very beginning. The case remained officially unsolved. No one was charged. No remains were ever found. No forensic evidence identified where Lorna went after she stepped away from her station wagon. Years later, Russell Whitaker retired from medicine. Before leaving the clinic for the final time, he asked to hear the recovered voicemail once more. Everyone else stepped out of the room. When it ended, he rewound it himself. He listened again. The audio engineer noticed something. Russell wasn't paying attention to the caller. He was listening to the silence after the message. Almost as if he expected another sound to appear. When the tape stopped, he quietly said, "For 26 years, I believed nobody knew where she was." He looked toward the old answering machine that had sat on a shelf since 1990. Now I know somebody did. He paused. They just couldn't reach me. A few months after Russell's death, his family donated several boxes of clinic records to the local historical society. Most contained ordinary paperwork, patient newsletters, appointment books, photographs from community health fairs. While cataloging the collection, a volunteer discovered an unmarked envelope tucked inside a 1990 desk calendar. There was no stamp, no address, only Russell's name written across the front. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. No signature, no date, just one typed paragraph. Read. I tried calling again after the storm, but everyone said she had already disappeared. By then, I knew nobody would believe that I had spoken to her. I kept thinking I should come forward. Every year it became harder. If this letter is ever found, I'm sorry for waiting so long. There was no way to determine who wrote it. The paper contained no usable fingerprints. The typeface matched dozens of typewriters sold during the 1980s. The envelope had never been mailed. No one knew how it ended up inside the clinic. The letter did not solve the case. It didn't identify the writer. It didn't explain where Lorna went. It only confirmed what the forgotten voicemail had suggested decades earlier. Someone had met her that night. Someone had survived long enough to regret staying silent. The case file was updated one final time. Its closing note was unusually brief. Evidence indicates additional witnesses existed. Identity unknown. Today, the abandoned stretch of Route 250 looks much as it did in the winter of 1990. The original bridge is gone. The volunteer fire station has been renovated. The forestry road is blocked by a locked gate. Most drivers pass through without slowing down, unaware that one of the region's oldest unsolved disappearances unraveled, not because of a new witness, but because an unheard voicemail sat trapped inside obsolete equipment for more than a quarter of a century. And one question remains. If someone anonymously slipped that letter into Dr. Whitaker's clinic years after Lorna vanished, who knew exactly where to leave it without ever being seen?